Trap cards are back, baby. We haven't seen trap cards be as prevalent as they have been in a while, with the format shifting from a combo and massive negate board to a more calamities go burst style of combo deck. We're also seeing the change where trap cards, inherently a good counter to calamities, are making a comeback. And so in today's video, I want to discuss trap cards in the current metagame, why they are back, the history of trap cards in recent memory, and why in recent memory they haven't been nearly as prevalent as they are now. But before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy my content. Make sure to follow me on Twitch as I am streaming a lot more. And with that, let's begin. So most trap cards have been unplayable in recent memory. Let's discuss with a few different points. First off, in 2019, the format was just a lot faster because the decks were so much quicker. You have a control deck like Sky Striker that uses spell cards instead of the traditional trap cards to start steamrolling advantage. Whereas in the past, you'd have decks that either use a monster engine to steamroll advantage. Even then, you had Salamangreat in 2019, but the point being that in the past, you'd have a deck like Yugioh as a trap strategy, for example, where you have your trap cards that act as disruption because they're higher ceiling than what other cards can provide, and you'd also have your Yugioh monster acting as a resource generating engine in order to, well, steamroll advantage and eventually overwhelm your opponent with cards. Whereas in 2019, you have a deck like Sky Striker where sure, you have your boss monster being Ray, but at the same time, the cards that steamrolled advantage and acted as disruption were your spell cards. And because of that, it provided a very different realm of resource generation than in the past, where instead of monsters acting as +1s or trap cards acting as +1s, even now we have a deck that acts as trap cards with +1s being the Eldritch engine, but we also have Sky Striker being a deck that uses spell cards in specific. So while that acted very differently, you'd have Salamangreat, which is a more traditional mid-range type strategy where you'd have monsters that are faster than trap cards and you're able to use them to overwhelm your opponent with advantage and remove your opponent's advantage, while at the same time using in-theme searchable trap cards. Even other combo decks like Orcus would use an in-theme searchable trap card, but only one of it because you only needed one crescendo. But I guess the point to be made is that because of the way the control and combo decks were designed at the time, additionally with the fact that the speed of those decks and the format as a whole was really fast, it just made trap cards not a good mesh with the rest of the metagame. While sure, you would have some trap cards being relevant. Some good examples are There Can Be Only One, Compulsory Evacuation Device, and a few others. While those were relevant, generally speaking, most of the decks were not compromised of trap cards. Fast forward to 2020 and you'd still see a lack of trap cards. I mean, we'd have Emancipator format with Eldritch. Now, Eldritch in specific is one of the key factors into trap cards coming back. You'd have Eldritch cards, which in theme engine wise, you'd be playing a ton of trap cards, but because of the speed of the format, ignoring the Eldritch cards were really fast, you had to play cards like hand traps. And hand traps, I gotta know, are a very important concept to keep in mind when talking about the history of trap cards, because the history of trap cards and the history of hand traps are very integrally tied. When you have a slower format to the point where you can play higher ceiling cards like trap cards, then you're able to get away with not playing as many hand traps. Whereas hand traps, because of the speed of them, are sometimes a necessity over trap cards in order to stop a very fast deck like a combo deck. Sometimes hand traps just have a very specific niche use that makes them more impactful than trap cards. But generally speaking, trap cards are higher ceiling. And generally speaking, when you're deck building, you want a higher ceiling over a lower ceiling. And because of that, that's why trap cards right now are making a comeback. Before we continue, make sure to check out my TCG Player affiliate link, where you can help support the channel by purchasing any of your favorite Yu-Gi-Oh cards, or any card game at that matter. With that, let's continue. In 2020, we've had Emancipator, and then we had Dragon Link and Infernoble, and those decks were just too fast to play trap cards with. But now we're slowing down into a format where Calamities is the only thing that really is like quote-unquote degenerate other than Drytron, which I'll discuss in a second. But with these trap cards, you can actually counter Calamities because, well, Calamities doesn't affect trap cards. And what is the best strategy that meshes well with trap cards? Well, we have a Lich. So as you're seeing right now, it's a perfect storm of the right archetypes being in the metagame with the right trap cards that raise the ceiling of the format with the right counters to a deck like Virtual World. So yes, I would say all of these combinations come to one, and that is why trap cards are making a comeback. It is because the current state of the format is slow enough to where you can play trap cards effectively, and trap cards can counter these decks very well. Now it does get a little more complicated. My next video is going to be discussing Drytron and the rise of Drytron in the current format, and that deck somewhat complicates things a bit. There are a ton of counters to the strategy, but at the same time it also makes some pretty crazy end boards in the form of end boards with cards like Apollosa, Herald of Ultimateness with multiple fairies in hand, the obvious Vanity Ruler variant. You have Megaliths, which complicate things because you can pop like 4 cards on the opponent's turn. So yeah, Drytron is a force to be reckoned with, and while I don't think that deck alone requires a necessity of more hand traps in the format, I do think Drytron's existence inherently does make trap cards a little more complicated, especially if people gravitate towards the Megalith build, because the Megalith build will destroy all your back row before you even get a chance to activate it. And this ties back to the speed of a format. If the speed of the format is slow enough and the decks don't disrupt your back row like all at once, then you're able to activate trap cards, then trap cards are playable. But if you cannot even activate a trap card without losing a ton of advantage, that is when trap cards are unplayable. As of right now, however, the format is slow enough where you can actually set 5 and have that be a force to be reckoned with. And because of that, trap cards are back for the time being. But if you want to learn more about the other decks of the format, for example, Virtual World, make sure to click on an end screen in front of you. Thank you so much for watching, and with that, I hope to see you soon.